All right, so I know some of the other L series, you had three people up here, unfortunately, for today. Yeah, today we're going to be talking a little bit about destination tourism, recreation. I work for, as Terry had mentioned, I work for a company, ESA. We're based in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. We've got a few different offices, 7 locations, 3 folks working there. And we're spread out all over the country. We've got an office in Shanghai, so we do have a relatively global presence. I personally, I work in the New York office, but I live in Las Vegas. So we do a lot of remote work. It doesn't seem to be too much of a problem since we do a lot of international work anyway. It's calls regardless of where you are in the US. So the topics that I wanted to go through today, I wanted to start off with a little bit of an intro to resort design, hospitality, kind of like a 101 5-minute class on that. And then jump a little bit into private and public tourism destinations. So some of these start to overlap a little bit with other sectors. I think in terms of what we do at EDSA with our bread and butter being hospitality, we do like to look at it in those 2 different categories. Then we can go through some of the hospitality guidelines. Those are what we use at the start of every project when we're going through conceptual design, schematic design, and presentations to the client. And then there's 2 case studies at the end that I think will give a good idea of what a public tourist destination would be, how we navigate that process versus a private. Also, feel free to jump in here if you have any questions or comments or insults or whatever you want to throw out. All right, so hospitality intro. My curiosity, by show of hands, who has traveled internationally? All right, so a lot of folks. Would you say, by another show of hands, is it mostly Central America, South America, or are you traveling across the pond? Across the pond? Okay. I'm just curious. I bring that up because I know when we start to talk about design and start to talk about architecture, the more you know about other places, the more you can be informed about what's in front of you. So I think there is a really big importance on travel, and it really does impact the way that you can think about spaces, places, and improve your means as a designer. So maybe just a little shout out that if you have an opportunity to travel, take it. It'll definitely help you grow as a professional and a designer. But anyway, so specifically here, this chart is I would say EDSA I work for, but this is a general overview of where the hot tourism markets are in the world right now. So Central America down to the tip of South America, that's been hot for a long time. Mexico is always big. You've got Cancun, you've got Cozumel, and the Baja Peninsula has always had a lot of tourism development there. So we see a lot of projects there. The Caribbean is another big region that we work in. And I think that's going to continue over the next 15, 20 years. China, I would say we saw a lot in 2010 to 2015. That was our biggest source of income. And we've seen that start to tail off a little bit more, but some of the other countries are picking up. Like Vietnam is starting to get big. And some of the other countries in the West Pacific. And then right now, the biggest location where we see most of our work coming from is going to be Saudi Arabia and the UAE, where I don't know if anyone's heard of the NEOM projects or some of the mega developments that are happening over there. A little bit of client structures, and this is not specific to the tourism industry. This is really across the board, working internationally and in the United States. But I wanted to give a little bit of a comparison between some of the work that we're doing in Central America versus Saudi Arabia, because it's a completely different structure, and it's important to understand who your client is and how to work with them. So on the left-hand side of the screen, you can see that we're hired directly by the developer, and we work directly with the operator. So the operator would be in hospitality like Hilton or Marriott or Six Senses. And the developer's paying for it. So there's really kind of 2 clients that you navigate in the tourism process. But in that that scenario, it's quite easy to have a conversation, make decisions, and get answers to your design quickly. Versus if you're looking on the right side of the screen, that's the example of the Saudi Arabia structure, where it's a government entity or the crown prince who's making all the executive decisions on these designs, goes through a government development agency, then through a development team who could be folks hired from England, or a lot of folks are hired from England, honestly. And then it goes through us. So we have to navigate a lot of different people and figure out who the key players are in order to get decisions made. So I think what's important about that is that what we get to learn as landscape architects is, one, you get insight into a lot of different forms of government. And you get to get a more of a global understanding of how the politics start to work in these areas. And then two, it forces you to start to get a strategy together with your clients on again who those key players are going to be. The other thing that's important before we jump into one of these projects is that you have to understand what the brand is and what the operator is that you're working for. So on the left side of the screen, Hilton and Marriott, on the global spectrum, they might be a lower end brand. So your material selection, the way that you design spaces, you're designing for a person that can't afford those types of hotels or those types of tourist destinations. Or on the right side, Six Senses or Faena, that might be somewhere where it's like a $10,000 a night hotel, and the clientele that wants to stay at a $10,000 a night hotel is not going to want the same experience that someone in a Hilton or Marriott would have. So before you even jump into a project, it's really understanding who's going to be using the space at the end of the day. One of the things that we're starting to see, and this really started to happen, I would say around like 2010, a little bit before, but it's really ramped up recently, is a movement in this brand identity for a lot of these operators. So you have a lot, I would say in like the 90s, 2000s, and even up until recently, a lot of people want to go to a resort, stay there, and not leave. So it's like you get off the plane, get on a bus, get to the resort, and everything's included inside that resort, whether it's your restaurants, your pools, everything's in one location. And I think now with this new generation of people that are able to afford to travel, to be able to visit these places, they want that local experience. They want to eat the food of the region. They want to do the things that the locals do. And that's changed the structure of a lot of these resorts. From, instead of thinking within these walls, it's how do you get people out into the surrounding community, and how do you start to activate the local community. So just to split the kind of work that we do when we're talking about tourism and hospitality, I wanted to break this down into private versus public. And I think that you can think of that in two different ways. It's the client. So private client being a hotel brand or a developer, and public would likely be a municipality. But it's also the way that you start to think about space, where in a private hotel or resort, it's a very different way of thinking about planning and how people use it, because it's exclusive, right? Like you want to go to a resort and have your own private cabana. You want to have your own private chase lounge. But when you're designing a tourism destination in the public realm, you want to do that you're designing for a more democratic group of people, right? You want to include everyone. You want to use all the principles that we learn as landscape architects. So it's a different way of thinking about those two different areas. So left side, hotels, resorts, spas, casinos, branded residences, and then on the public side, that's where you get more into your public realm with iconic civic spaces, promenades, mixed use areas, and then even national parks or forests. So to go through these and just give an example of each, this is Castiglione del Bosco in Italy. This would be a private hotel. So it's all of your operations really residing within that one specific parcel. And if anyone wants to leave, they're departing the property. Compared to Atlantis in the Bahamas, where this is a fully inclusive zone where there's a lot more program that's happening. You have a lot of pool decks. You've got a lot of restaurants that are happening, entertainment venues, a full campus of things to visit when you're traveling. Then looking at casinos and hotels, I think when we look at these, it's really similar to a hotel or to a resort, depending on the scale. The difference in this is that there is an expectation that a lot of people are going to be gambling. So when you start to put your numbers together for how big the pool should be, how many chase lounges you should have out on the deck, how much area people are going to be used, it's reduced significantly because there's a large portion of the people that want to stay in the building the whole time. And then finally in private, looking at branded residences. So this was a property in Mexico where you have I don't know who this was, so I'm going to say it was Hilton. You have the Hilton Clubhouse, you have the pool decks are all by them, and then the branded residences are actually sold. But if you decide to buy one of those, you don't have any control over the property. So you're not able to like swap out your pool or change the way the fences work. It's a preset property that you're buying into. And a lot of people like that if it's their 6th, 7th, or 8th property, where they don't actually have to think about it. Okay, so then going back now into some of the examples of public iconic civic spaces. And I think what makes them a tourist destination is the fact that there is something iconic to see. There's a piece of architecture that's famous that they want to witness. And what we're trying to do in these scenarios is you're trying to highlight that building and trying to create it as a destination. So a lot of the public realm design is framed on that structure or framed within the context of the city grid in that area. Looking at Fort Lauderdale Beach in Florida, this is another example where the main amenity or the main tourist attraction isn't necessarily an iconic piece of architecture, but it's a natural feature. So the beach here, everyone is coming down to the beach to experience that. So when we're thinking about this park, it's all about the interface between that amenity and the design that we're doing. Valletta Waterfront in Malta. This is looking at more the historic aspect of it. So historic piece of architecture, historic feel to that entire city. So it's making sure that materials that we're using, scale of the places that we're using all blend within the fabric that's already existing in the region. And then looking at public use destinations. This is Blue Waters in the UAE, so this is a constructed island. But this becomes a destination because of iconic features, mixed use, and shopping. It's a good reason to get people to an area. So starting to think about the people that want to come to a place to shop as opposed to come to a place for a more passive environment. And then finally, this is Puerto Rico and El Yunque, where the feature is outside. So it's how limited of a footprint and just really highlight what's happening outside of the ecology and the surrounding area. So these are the lists, and I'll break these down in the following slides, but this is the list of guiding principles in hospitality that we like to use, but when we're starting to kick off these projects. And the first one is social and economic diversity. Who are we designing for? So I think the first thing that this goes back to some of the beginning slides that we talked through. We're never designing for ourselves. And I think that this applies to not just tourism or hospitality. This applies to all projects that we do as landscape architects, where you are not the client and you're not necessarily the person that's going to be using the space at the end of the day. So it's really critical for us to understand what the regional demographic is and what the customs lifestyle of the people that live in that area is, so that we can design appropriately for them. And just looking at these couple slides, like if you're comparing to do a design for some surfer bros in Costa Rica, that's a very, very different way to think about a space than for a very high-end, very wealthy family in the Middle East, where it could be a very casual, organic design on the right side, and on the left side might turn into a very tailored or sophisticated final product. So the next slide here is the celebrating the environment. And the first point of pay close attention to detail. This idea of sense of place, I think, is it's relatively simple, but the more you travel and the more that you see, the more that you realize how different places are. So something as simple in Virginia as a barn, looking at the X's on the doors, the way that the roof structure is designed, that can be the sense of place. It's not a hidden pattern, but it's just when you compare that to something that might be happening in the Middle East or something that might be happening in Central America, you really do start to see the differences between locations. And it is critical to get those details right, because you need to do the research for each region you're working in, because if that pattern is wrong and it doesn't actually meet the historic relevance that it's supposed to, could end up being a problem depending on who's using the site. And then the last point here is just the environment is not necessarily just the built world, but it is also the natural environment and ecology. So the next thing here is introduce the journey. Again, this is not specific to tourism development, but it is a critical part of what we do there. It's how does someone get to the site, and how does someone first experience being on the property? So, and this was an example of something in a project we were working on in Saudi, and it's a 25-minute drive to get to the front door of the resort. So it's really thinking about, it's like when you get off that plane, you get into your car and you're driving through sand dunes for 25 minutes. Do you want the experience at the front door to be the same? Or do you want something really unique that starts to define this property as being something special? Or you could look at it from the other way of saying, I want to fit the context of the region, and I want to put the exact same view corridors that really start to highlight the water, start to highlight the sand dunes, start to tell you where you are on that site. So there's a lot of different ways to approach the problem, but it is important to create a strategy of how you're going to get people to the property. The next one here is excite the senses. And this, I think immediately when I hear this one, I always think of themed experiences, whether it's theme parks or I don't know, some sort of aquatic adventures or things like that. But it does also apply to more subtle cues, where it's, if you're on the water, create access to the water so you can touch the water, smell the water, get into the water. In the environment or in the more themed locations, you have the smells of like the popcorn, and you have food or pretzels or something like that. So it's thinking about all the senses when you're going through the design. And it's not just the physical design of what's put in the ground, but how the operations of that place start to take place, what might happen when someone starts to run it. And then the other point on here, blend interior and exterior spaces. We're seeing that a lot now, and that's where like the image in the bottom left-hand corner, when you're inside but you're looking up at an aquarium, it feels like you're within that space. Or when you have a villa that doesn't have a defined door of what's interior and exterior space, it really connects you back to the environment that you're in. Green infrastructure, again, this applies to across the board on what we do as landscape architects, but it's in the planning of some of these new developments that are happening. You need to make sure that you're accommodating the stormwater runoff. You're addressing green infrastructure issues at the macro level, but then also when you get down to the site design. And we're starting to see customers for a lot of these brands appreciate and pay attention to those types of networks more than they had in the past. So when you start to put together a system or a garden that's cleaning the water, and you can tell a guest that that's what's happening, they get more excited about it, and they feel more connected, and they feel better about visiting that property knowing that it is sustainable. Value the integrity of materials. Another thing that just really value to place. So when we're specifying materials on these projects, we always try to figure out what the local quarries are in the regions, figure out where the timber is coming from in the region, where the cement is coming from. And it's not only does that cut down on construction costs, but it also makes you feel like you're connected back to the region. When you see the rock on the mountain is the same rock that's building the walls, it feels like it's from the same place. Create moments of reveal. So this one is there's thinking about it in terms of what do you want to highlight on the site? Do you want to highlight a specific tree, highlight a lagoon? But there's also how do you start to highlight those things throughout the day and think of what experience and what someone's going to be doing at a specific time. So on a resort, you might think that everyone's going to be going out to dinner approximately when the sunset's happening. So where is that sunset happening? Are your cafes or your restaurants all framing views out to that sunset to have that $1 million view or that moment that someone's going to remember and want to come back to? And then there's also evolution that happens throughout the seasons. So thinking about not just what the perfect day in summer is going to be like, but is someone going to want to be there on a cold day in winter? And how do you accommodate that and make it a comfortable environment? Multifunctional spaces. This one's interesting too, and this keys more to, I would say, the public realm of tourism that we work with, but it's designed for the unexpected. So when we create a design and we hand that over to a local municipality to take control of the operations over it, we don't have necessarily control of how they're going to do it. So we can propose that this specific location on the site is where you're going to set up a stage. We did this because of all the framed views, but we don't know that how that site's going to evolve and how people want to set up events there. So always design for the unexpected and understand that there's probably going to be some evolution to what you put together. And then provide for memorable experiences. I think there's a difference here in what's iconic versus what's the human scale and what are people going to remember. Where the shot on the right that's in Dubai. These really iconic sculptures that go up, where as an adult walking through that space, you probably understand that that's interesting, that's unique, that's something that I'm going to remember. It makes a great photo. But for the kids that are on the left, it might not be meaningful for them. So it's create spaces within these larger areas where you're creating memorable experiences from kids all the way through everyone. And then this one to me is interesting with leveraging emerging technologies, where there's two parts of this. So one of them is that what the constructability technologies, what we can do differently that we haven't been able to do in the past. And then two is how we are designing differently based on the new technology. So the first one is for seen and unseen technologies. On the left-hand side, it's very clear that there's a digital board up there that's projecting something that can change. And that's, it's visible and everyone knows it and it feels techy. But then there's also the right side of the screen, which is infrastructure on technology, another word, improvements that are happening where you can start to build things that are what's shown on the right, where it's structural design. It's being able to, I guess it's different materials, different strengths of bar, different concrete densities, where we're starting to be able to build these places that are previously unseen. And then the other part of it is that from the design side, we're starting to see, mostly in landscape architecture, because architects are a little bit ahead of us in terms of technology with Revit, but a total merging of all the disciplines. So interior design, landscape architecture are all being required on these mega projects to work in Revit and have continuous landscape updates. So it's a dramatic shift in our design process, and the way that we have to work into our contracts, concept and schematic phases in order to make sure that we're at a point that we're comfortable in before we get to that modeling effort. Okay, so then this is getting into two of the case studies. The first one is going to be a public project. It's the Los Olas Corridor Improvements Project in Florida. And that's a city project. And then the second one is going to be a private Six Senses resort that I didn't work on, so I might struggle through that one a little bit. So this is the first one. So Los Olas Corridor Improvements. This was a project I worked on for, I guess, 8 years. It still hasn't technically closed out. So we've got one water main that needs like a valve changed, and then we're finally done with it. But this was a project that was a city funded project. It was paid for by tax dollars. So it has all of the, I guess it really does fall into the public realm and parks sector. But what makes this a little bit unique is that it is right on the Fort Lauderdale beach at the terminus of Los Olas Boulevard, which is the main arterial that goes straight through the city. And it's one of the more well-known boulevards in South Florida for restaurants and so this portion of the beach is the most used part of the beach. It used to have a history for being like the spring break capital of the world. So city wanted to do is create a facelift on it and make it a family destination as opposed to a spring break destination. And what that means is that we needed to look at it of how are we going to create a place for tourists, the right demographic of tourists, meaning not people throwing beer cans all over the place and trashing the beach. But then at the same time, how do you create or not detract from the local population that lives there? So it's really three different groups of people that we wanted to make sure that we're doing. And that took a lot of time. We spent a lot of time through the public process, convincing people in the local towers that this was a good thing. It's an interesting process to navigate because regardless of what you're changing, there's always people that are going to come out to oppose it. So this was 3 surface parking lots, and the neighbors didn't want it to become a park. They were upset that you were taking away from the parking. So there's always a navigation that needs to happen when you're going through that. But anyway, at the end of the day, ended up working out. I think that going back to some of the points or some of the hospitality guidelines that we went through that we tried to accomplish in this park is that flexibility of space. So Fort Lauderdale hosts the International Boat Show, and the main loading point from all of those docks is down here, and that's the main gateway to get into the show. So we know that the show is going to evolve over time. We know that it's going to change. So how do we design this to be able to accommodate that? And the answer is really just we kept it as flexible as we possibly could. So when the event gets set up, there's a lot of I guess temporary structures that go in to be able to fulfill that need. But then for the rest of the year, it's an open park that people play soccer on. It becomes a good open space on the beach for the local population as well. One of the other things that we looked at for this is that that during specific events, there's going to be a tremendous amount of people that are walking through this area, using the area. So durability of materials is really important for everything that we're putting out there. And then flexible space and events, going back to that earlier point of just making sure that there's available area to host different things. One of the things that I wanted to talk about on this project is change in policy. So a lot of the time we focus on the built environment or what's going to be constructed at the end of the day. But there's a lot of things that do constrict what we can do. There's code requirements at all levels, at city, state, federal. There's constructability requirements that kind of constrain us. So the one thing that I think that's really exciting we can do is that we have an ability as landscape architects to change policy, but it does take a lot of effort. And in this particular project, we had a situation where sea turtle nests are all over this beach. It's one of the best places in Fort Lauderdale to go see some of the hatchings. And in order to not have the sea turtles run towards the road there's a requirement at the state level that says all the lights need to be amber LEDs. And what that does is the turtles can't see that spectrum, so they follow the moon instead of following the lights, and they go out into sea. Everything's great. The issue is that those amber lights have a very, very low photometric reading on the ground. So it's dark out there for the majority of the year, like so dark that their crime is becoming a problem in the area. And the city raised that as a big concern. So what we did on this project is we went up to Tallahassee and we said, look, this turtle nesting season only happens 6 months of the year. Other half of the year, let's use a different type of light. So we were able to change the policy at the state level to allow for amber LEDs during a certain time of the year, white LEDs for the rest of it. And it was on a time clock board that could switch back and forth. And so that has reduced the amount of crime in the area during that season with the light. And it hasn't impacted the turtle nesting requirements. So I think that was, I guess, outside of tourism, but I think that was a key point to bring up where we do have that kind of impact, or we can have that kind of impact if you're willing to bake it into your contract and spend the time on it. And then again, this is just an image showing the community impact, some of the local events. And again, the tent that's out here is not where we had programmed it, or we talked to the city about where it's going to go. Some of the farmers market that starts to show up on the beach side was in a different location than what we had illustrated, but because the space was designed to be flexible, there's a lot of opportunities where the operator can lay it out and use it however they'd like. So then talking a little bit about some of the economic impact of this project, where it was purchased by tax dollars, CRA region. So all of pretty much what happened is that you have are we familiar with the CRA district? Maybe, no. So, all right. So CRA, community redevelopment area. What it is that they box off in a plan an area of parcels, and all of the tax dollars get frozen at a certain date. And the increment of those tax dollars going up gets put into a pot of money, and that pot of money has to be used on public infrastructure improvements within that CRA district. So really what's happening is that the local residents are putting money in a pot to be spent on their own improvements. And that's what this project was the result of that. And what you see after that goes in is that when there is a change from parking lots to green spaces or areas that people are going to enjoy spending time, and that property value does go up in all the surrounding neighborhoods. So we did see that in all the towers surrounding the parks. And we also, the other thing that was able to happen with this, because everything was compiled in a parking structure, we were able to open up another parking lot, which allowed for a marina expansion to happen, mega yacht marina. And that is, that in turn is going to make property values go up even more. So there is an economic impact to what we do. Oh, and the last point here, it's for restaurants, cafes, the more people that are coming through that aren't walking through parking lots and are actually spending time residing in a place, the more money that they're going to spend in some of the surrounding areas. So that's what we saw as well. Environmental impact. Turtle nesting habitat we talked about. We selected 100% native plant species for gardens. So you see a lot more pollinators when you go down there. You see hummingbirds, the bees. Great for the environment, because a lot of the requirements on the beach are limited to species that are going to survive in a coastal environment. So when you do take the next step and you really push to get local species in there, you start to see a change in that ecology. Rainwater harvesting in the shade canopy, we were able to capture water in that building, hold it in a cistern underground, and then use it for flushing toilets in the bathrooms and irrigation water on the site. And then removal of surface parking and cleaning the water before they enter the outfalls. That's just inherent in getting rid of hardscape and being able to keep the intercoast a little bit cleaner than it was before. The second project here is the Six Senses and TCI, Turks and Caicos. It's in the Northwest Point on Provo. And Six Senses, I would say, in terms of operators that we're looking at, they're leading the industry in sustainability and involving the local folks in the area. So this project was, most of what you're seeing here is probably someone's third or fourth home. They're high-end villas, very, very high-end villas, and there's a large resort component tied to this. But what they did is that this whole bottom section here is it's local farms. So they provided farmland to people that live in the area that they can work on. They created a community down here for those workers. So it has its own pool component, it has its own restaurants, has its own cafes. And they created restaurants that were farm to table. So it's essentially what's being grown here is being sold here to the people that are visiting the resort. So it's a lot of their resorts are in places where the income is pretty low. And this is an opportunity where hiring only local staff to come in, providing jobs to the area, and then providing an experience to the guests that's local. And this is just some of the examples for the initiatives that Six Senses has for sustainability. They do coral growth in some of their locations. It's the hiring for some of the farms and quite a few other initiatives. And then this was just an enlargement of that area. So you start to see some of the program elements with the general store, staff housing, staff amenities, and then the integrated farm network directly on site. So I wanted to end this with a slide. Terry had mentioned I can get touchy-feely for one slide, so I'll try to do that. And I was thinking about what motivates me, and I'd encourage you to do the same thing. But I've found that it's continuously learning. I'm not a book guy. I'm not someone that does well sitting down and learning from text. But this idea of in our industry, where every day I'm going into work and I'm learning about construction methods, and whether it's something of like assembling a deck all the way through undercast piles, grade beams, like tower construction for an 80-story building. You just start to piece these pieces of the puzzle together. And I think that's what gets me to get up in the morning and keep going to work. And it's what we do. There's so many different aspects to it, where you have construction, you have the cultural experience, you have traveling the world, being able to see different places. You have the art and design aspect of it, where the actual drafting and craftsmanship of our drawings that we propose to clients. And then there's the technology aspect of it, where whether it's like trying to figure out the new Autodesk system that came in and its updates, or CAD or something like that, or it's some of the new Revit things that are coming together, or construction technologies that are always evolving. That variety is what gets me excited about landscape architecture. That's all I have. Does anyone have any questions or comments?
Thank you for your presentation. It is very exciting to see your project from NSA, because when I was practice, I also involved in a public level of tourist destination project. And so what are different challenges in public and private level of destination project? For example, maybe budget constraints, or design process, or governance, or city approval.
I would say there's probably more challenges on a public project than private. When you're working with a private client, you get very direct response. When you're working on a public project, there's a lot of committees, advisory boards, things that you need to go through and get approval. And I think there's also a sense of ownership from the client on a private project that you don't necessarily get with a city or a municipality. So I think in terms of speed and efficiency private is much easier to navigate. As I had mentioned in the beginning, though, some of the projects in Saudi and in the UAE, those are almost a combination where technically it's a private project, private developer, but it's all run by the crown prince of the country. So that one's almost that's the perfect storm, right? Anyone else?
You work with local firms in the implementation of the project, or?
We do. I would say it's a combination. It really depends on the scale of the project. For some of the smaller resorts that we do in Central South America, I would say it's a lot more local consultants, just because they know the code better. Like civil engineers, architects, most of them will be local. As landscape architects, I think it's a little bit easier for us to move between different countries and not have to pay as much attention to the code as we would in the United States. For the larger projects in the Middle East and in China, I would say that it's more of the global companies that are working on them. So for civil engineering, it might be a Buro Happold where they have thousands of employees and they just happen to have an office that's in Dubai and work with them. But yeah, I'd say a combination of both.
They bring this extra information that you mentioned about the local characteristic materials, or that data that you set up your own material welcoming.
So that's on us to research. We will occasionally hire an expert if that is really important, or if we're working in a sensitive region. But yeah, I would say that's really on us to bake into our fee and the conceptual design, the research, all at the beginning of the project. Yeah, it's a lot of homework.
Could you talk a little bit about one of the projects or something that happened that you just are really proud of in your work?
Proud of in my work. The most proud that I've been was on that Las Olas project in Tallahassee and getting them to agree to the turtle nesting, because it's so obvious. Like it seems like it's like here, it's safety. We can solve a problem with safety and with saving the local ecology. And the people that are in the room are like, but it's not by the book. It's like, I understand, but that took a long time. It took 3 years to push through, and it became it's been codified. So now all new development that's happening along Fort Lauderdale, Miami, all that, they can change the lights and benefit. So
Such a small thing, but so important.
yeah, and it's funny. It wasn't even something that was really in our scope. Like we hired an electrical engineer to be doing it. So like the actual detail of what was implemented didn't come from our drawings, but it was our initiative to push the electrical engineer to hire lobbyists to go there and work with the state. Yeah.
I want to go back to the first thing you said about traveling and being exposed to other cultures. How did it affect the way you perceive landscape architecture in ways that even when you mentioned the Middle East, we are kind of going to the Western kind of way of designing. However, like being there, or I don't know, understanding the culture, did your design have been accompanying whatever that we think that it's right, but it's more right in our kind of.
That's a really interesting question. I think maybe there's two parts. The first one is that by traveling, I think when you get the context of traveling somewhere else, you understand what the context is of where you are. Where like I grew up in the Northeast, and it's been like through high school, through college, it was all a very similar landscape when you're talking about topography and farming and people and all of that. So I'm trying to think about a sense of place or where it was. I don't think that really resonated until traveling somewhere else where you can contrast back to what it was. And I think that's been important going in reverse too. So in some of the work that we're doing in the Middle East, it is interesting that they do not want necessarily local patterns, textures, but they want to have more of a like a Western approach to a lot of those properties, which is, in a sense, it can be frustrating for us because we're like, no, this is your lifestyle, this is your culture. We want to be able to design within that framework. And when they come back, they're like, no, we want like a European garden. It's like, wait. That doesn't. So I guess to answer your question, it's the traveling is definitely opens your eyes to see these different things. But you still need to listen to what the client's saying, because at the end of the day, they're paying the bills.
That's the struggle.
Yeah. Anyone else?
Can you talk about the impact of summer travel you had in school?
Summer travel. My impact on you or
On me too. That impacts me a lot.
we had a great time. That was so I did 3 study abroads when I was here. I did the first one I did to Egypt with the architecture school. Second one I did the travel program with Terry and Minte. And then the third was to Switzerland with the architecture school for a semester. Yeah, I don't know if I can understate the importance that that's had on my career. It's not something that you can point out and say like, that's what changed it. It's just the fact that you are in all these different places and you remember that. So when you're putting a design together, you can think in your head, it's like, okay, I want it to be sort of like that place, or that was a really successful area. And the more you travel, the more you learn, the more you experience, the bigger your toolbox gets, and the easier it is to design. So I don't know. I mean, I think it's invaluable.
How much a store does EDSA put on employees' experience at work?
Quite high. I think it's more so there is a limitation. There's a real limitation on the client of who's going to pay for you to travel, and if they'll allow you to get flights and go. So a lot of our travel is to Central America, or the Caribbean, or in local projects, but there is a heavy importance on those at the beginning of a project to see the site. And it's not just from an understanding of what's there, like the geomorphology or the landscape or things that you're not going to be able to pick up in pictures or data you can find online, but it's the realness of a place. When you're designing on a piece of paper, sometimes you forget that place actually exists. And by doing a workshop on site, it really reinforces that idea of this is a real place, this is a real client. And you can knock out a lot of the details pretty early with having a workshop to kick off a design.
What was like the initial spark for you to decide that you want to go into this facet of landscape architecture? Like, was this a study interest that you had while you were in school, or did it come up when you were looking for a job?
So I was the opposite. I wanted to get into community development. That's what I did my senior thesis on. And I figured I would start at EDSA for a couple of years, and then I'd switch into community design. And what's happened is that the first 8 years I was working on that, and it was public realm. And to me, that was really valuable. I like being able to, at the end of the day, like going back to that site and see people using the space that you designed. I feel like there's a lot of value that came out of that. And that's what's kept me there. And I think that I've been able to now select projects that I'm working on that I can get that same kind of value out of. I think a lot of times the tourism hospitality industry gets a little bit of a bad rap. I think there's probably some reason for that. But I think that as long as you're selective in what you're doing and you solve the problem to the best of your ability, you could turn some of those things around. Anyone else?
So,
Thanks for having me.
thank you, Pete.